Hey guys, it's Pedro back with another interview covering DreamHack Dallas 2024. And for this occasion, I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach for this occasion. I have here with me Chobra, who as of now is covering the Starcraft 2 tournament for said convention. But I have here with me just to talk about that. And also, in addition to that, obligatory Valorant. So, Chobra, really appreciate you taking the time and just making this happen for me. First off, as you mentioned a little bit sometime right after we met, you're feeling a little tired, feeling a little jet lag. How are you kind of taking that kind of thing so far?
I guess it's been a while since I've traveled halfway around the globe for an event, and it's been a long time. I used to travel so much, so it used to be that my body would know just exactly when to fall asleep and when to wake up on the plane for flights from it would just know if I was going to Europe or if I was going to Asia, etc. Back when I was in LA. But obviously, again, it's been a little bit since I've traveled, so not adjusting as fast as I used to, but I think I'm forgiven because it's only been 2 days. But we've been blessed with a pretty smooth day one over at the Starcraft 2 stage, so it's been pretty good.
Of course, it's kind of been a massive. Well, for someone as you who has been in esports for quite a long time, you've been able to just kind of transition from one game to another. This is no different, covering after seeing you cover Valorant and specifically in the VCT Pacific. How have you kind of seen the transition now to Starcraft? Has it kind of been just simple as it usually has been for your case, or has it been kind of difficult in that sense? How'd you kind of view your transition?
Yeah, I guess thankfully it's been pretty smooth. Obviously, I used to work quite a few StarCraft events way back when, but I didn't even realize it until I saw some people talking about it after the talent announcement went out, that it's been basically nearly a decade since I've worked a StarCraft event. So a lot has changed since then, whether it's the game, whether it's the players, etc. Obviously, I still followed the big storylines on the surface, but there were definitely some nerves, some butterflies, trying to just make sure, because I used to do a really good job and I used to really pride myself in being involved, knowing all the ins and outs of the StarCraft scene. So just wanting to make sure that I'm still giving the respect that the game deserves. But once we kicked off, especially stage hosting, I think this is something that I've always had a pretty big passion in. This is probably the thing I've done the most of in my career in terms of broadcast work. So after the first couple interviews, etc., things have been pretty good, and I think I'm right back in it, just enjoying the stage a little bit now.
I was just about to ask, do you feel you're fully returned to just the know-hows of the StarCraft esports scene, given the fact that it's been quite a while? And so on top of that, how long has it been since you last covered StarCraft?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly. I want to say around 9 years now since I've last worked a StarCraft event. So yeah, a lot has changed. But thankfully, also, a lot of the players that were good back then are still holding on, right? They might not be the best as they were back then, but they're still holding on. So that helps me a little bit. Also, at the end of the day, I think that the things that make StarCraft exciting, whether it's the stories, right, whether it's parts of the game, that hasn't changed drastically. Obviously, yeah, sure, the game gets patches, etc. People come up with new builds, things like that, and I may not be as privy to all the details as I used to be on that front. But at the same time, I think, depending on the role that you have on a broadcast, the things you're focusing on are different, right? So as a stage host, while yes, it's always going to help to have more game knowledge as much as you can, it's also not my duty to basically break everything down and know, every single in and out before it happens. But I do need to be able to identify it when it does happen, right? Or at least know where to go for the resources, whether it's, the fellow talent that I'm working with or whatever else it might be, to identify that. So I think it's been exciting. I mean, something about StarCraft and any other game that's 1v1, basically, I think there's a special excitement there that, it is just two people battling it out. They both know that it's purely up to them whether they win or lose. There's no other factors, and that's something that I've always found very exciting. So it's been good. It's been good.
You mentioned just a little bit about just the fact that the same faces are still in the scene. Do you feel like that's kind of a good thing, a bad thing, given the fact that we've, as you said, same faces, not many new people have kind of emerged to kind of unseat those kind of faces? How'd you kind of look at that?
I think it's not necessarily a bad thing just because it's not necessarily the exact same faces that are always getting like 1, 2, and 3, right? They're still there, like at the top. They're being discussed as some of the greatest players. But for instance, obviously, back when I was deeply involved, Cyril was not a topic of discussion. Obviously, now he is a very hot topic of discussion. But then, for instance, it's things like it's players like Dark, it's players like Hero. Where back when I was still involved in the scene, like I still remember I was out in Korea helping produce and film one of the pieces about Dark building up towards BlizzCon, about his goal of really becoming a best and ironing that out. And obviously he's still discussed as one of the best players that has touched the game, but is he at that level that he is now always being discussed as one that's potentially greatest of all time? Not necessarily, right? He's always at the top. So I think in some ways it's good because it really helps build a story. Not many games have that opportunity and advantage of having such a deep history. So I think it's nice that can be respected, but there's just enough change, right? Just enough turbulence that it's not stagnant.
And I will say that one game that has not been stagnant at all is Valorant. And, as someone that's kind of been covering the game, for a good amount of time now, mostly residing within the APAC/Pacific spectrum. How have you kind of seen the progression of the Valorant scene in that region? More so just looking at innovation, adaptation, refinement, sort of in the same kind of traits that you've seen in Starcraft. How had you kind of seen the progression and the similarity of those traits for you?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you brought up the comparison to StarCraft, because I think StarCraft is a game that, first of all, because it's been around for so long, and obviously even before StarCraft 2, then there's Brood War, et cetera, but because the genre has been around for so long, and StarCraft 2 now, as its standalone game, has been around for so long, it's easy for people from the outside and on the surface to say, like, oh, well, it doesn't change, right? Like, I know exactly how this matchup goes. There's always, like, the baseline of builders. But then you look at it deeply, and it's like, no, it actually has changed a lot. Like, I'm watching the matches this week, and I'm like, well, this feels nothing like and any of the patches and metas that I helped work through and I got to watch as a host in previous events, 10 years back. So it's like, okay, sure, obviously 10 years is a long time, but things do change. And if things can change there, then things are going to change everywhere. So anytime you think it's stagnant, I think as long as you have people who are passionate about wanting to really, really perfect the art, there will be change. Now, with Valorant, some discussion that we've seen is that maybe it's too volatile. I think it's still maybe a little too early to say. Obviously, there's always going to be tons of changes at the start of any game's life cycle, so we'll have to wait and see. But specifically for APAC, for Pacific, I think the trouble is that it was dominated by basically two teams for the longest time in the beginning, right? It was DRX and PaperX. So you had the DRX style, and then you had the PaperX style, and they were on absolute opposite ends. So teams basically kind of started to choose, do I copy the DRX style or do I copy the PaperX style? I think it's quite frankly, only this year in 2024, not even in 23 VCT Pacific, but this year where we're starting to see teams try to break out of that cocoon, right? Break out of that shell and say, like, okay, that's where we lean towards, like on the spectrum, we lean towards PaperX or DRX, but this is our style, or this is what we're good at, so we try to build on that.
Maybe like Gen G?
Yeah, Gen G is a great example, right? And in some ways, it really depends on how you look at them, but they've identified that, okay, our core strengths are very, very pure fundamental mechanics in an FPS, both individually and as a team, so we build around that. We build our strategy around that. We build our set plays around that, and look at where that's gotten them. I mean, I did not think this team was going to look this good right out the gate. Always the potential is going to be there. I've been giving a lot of credit to teams like Talon Esports, right? They've really started to identify, like, this is where we shine. And I think we'll start to see that more. But when you look at it from that lens, Pacific is perhaps still a little bit behind, because I think teams and the coaching staff, the infrastructure, the IGLing, et cetera, isn't quite there to foster that environment nonstop.
Just sort of doing it in a way that kind of diverts itself from those two aforementioned play styles, not just going in the DRX/PRX route, just kind of still in the process of just trying to find out a new way, a new route, a new form of play, right?
Yeah, and it's going to be a rocky road. So one team that I think has had the rockier end of it, and perhaps I think is probably getting more flack than they deserve necessarily as T1. Now, I get it. Listen, this is a team that I had high hopes for, and I have been scarred and burned throughout this entire year in 24. But at the same time, I see that they're trying. They're trying to find that balance. Now, will they ever find it, in this current system, whether it's the players, the coaching staff, the current meta, who knows, right? But at the very least, I can tell that they're trying to find that balance. And what we're going to start to find out in Pacific, I think, is we have a shortage of coaching staff and players even, right? Whether they don't have to necessarily be IGLs, but leaders in the game that have this experience of building your own thing, building your own style, building your own structure. And that takes time. So while we've had it in loads in other games in Asia, not so much in the FPS scene, especially more closer to TAC FPS. So I think that will come with time.
Who is someone that you feel has the potential to just take that mantle, just be that kind of leader / IGO or whatever else that's similar to those two roles in your mind, be it like Korean or APAC or anything like that?
Good question. That's an excellent question. Funnily enough, and maybe these are kind of rose-tinted glasses because he's not playing anymore because he's getting ready for military service. But I had a lot of hopes for Zeta. I thought that I thought he had a pretty strong backbone in what he believed was the way to play Valorant, right? He seemed to have a very clear idea of what direction he wanted to go, but then he also showcased, I think, several times on the different rosters he's been on that he knows how to work with the rest of the team, and he knows how to kind of bring out the strong suits. And there's still some other players that we're seeing that happen with. I think I want to give a big shout out to Cruz as well. I think all the rosters that he's been on through and through, right, with the Talon core, he's always, whenever he was the primary caller, you could tell that's when this team shined. So whatever he's doing, right, whether it's just the vibes, whether it's the actual calls, the strategy, whatever it might be, he knows how to make that work. He knows how to bring out the best in some of these players. And sometimes that's all it takes, right? It doesn't mean that you have to come up with the craziest set plays, but you just have to identify, well, what are we good at? And does that come together as a puzzle or does it not? Because if it doesn't, then we have to figure something else out.
No, for sure. And now I want to take a little bit of a different direction now, going over towards yourself. I want to know how has it been just trying to just understand, learn all of these teams, different roles, different ways of play since the moment you started covering Valorant till now, now as a fully fledged member of the VCT Pacific broadcast team. How have you kind of viewed your progression in that learning process in that regard?
So casting an FPS as a regular is something that I've always wanted to do ever since I joined OGN back in the day, in the League of Legends days, so back in 2013. Obviously, back in the day, Korea was rarely ever playing the same FPS the rest of the world was in terms of majority player base, so it never quite came through. With Valorant, was absolutely excited that opportunity was finally here. But something that I realized partway through my casting career in Valorant is that I've also never actually been, I guess, a steady regular caster for a single game. I've always bounced around, or I've always been juggling other things on the side. Back for League of Legends, I was still doing translations, helping out with the marketing team and helping just the global team at OGN with business. And then since then, I've done a lot of hosting, I've done a lot of producing, but really saying, okay, this is what I'm diving into. I want to dig deep. I want to really get to know the players, the games, etc. I realized, I guess I've never done this in my 10 plus years in esports, which is kind of crazy to think about given how much I've bounced around. So I think I've kind of course corrected, I would say, in the early days of VCT Pacific 2023 in realizing, I'm looking at this the wrong way. I used to just look at it as purely the numbers of the game itself, the patches, the stats of the players. But now I'm realizing, okay, as the teams are evolving, so we need to as well as commentators, and we need to really understand Like, why are these tendencies happening, right? What is it that this team is? What's their end goal? Because if I know that, then I can help explain what's going on. Because otherwise, it's always just going to be the same thing that the viewers can see. Like, you can see they're rotating, to whatever site because they found the alarm bot on whatever, other part of the map. Like, those are things that anyone can see once they start watching a lot of Valorant. But do I understand it's because, let's say this team like solely plays around one player, right? Or is it because they've now switched this comp and they're really trying to make this player a little bit more comfortable? Those intangibles that you really have to get to know by just getting really familiar with the team. Obviously, it helps if you get to know them outside of the game as well, but I think these are all things you can identify in the game. So I'm going to be honest. I mean, I've been pretty harsh on myself because I've always wanted to hold myself to high standards, and given my career in esports, I think I need to, even if this is like a newer position for me. To be very honest, I don't think I've been a bit satisfied at all with my casting so far. I'm satisfied with the direction I'm taking it in, but result-wise, I think the end goal that I want to reach in VCT or Valorant casting and commentating is a far shot from where I'm at now, and I think a big part of that is going to be understanding how teams view the game rather than solely how I view the game.
By that regard, do you feel covering Valorant is the hardest esport venture that you feel you've been undergoing in recent times?
So yes, but most specifically because I think casting Valorant is the hardest game I've ever commentated and casted. There's the quote. There's the feature quote. Yeah. It's crazy. I've talked with like the Korean Valorant casters as well, and most of us all agree, and a lot of us have done a ton of other games, right? Whether it's other FPSs, whether it's RTSs, MOBAs, whatever it might be. And this isn't to say that other games are easy to cast, but the thing with Valorant, it's not necessarily that the game is the hardest to understand, but it's the broadcasting portion of it because of the pacing of the game, the times that we're given, and then the balance of the chemistry, et cetera, et cetera. When you really break that down, Valorant's it's actually a very like saturated game in terms of broadcast time. And other casters have talked about this, I believe, in the past as well. But because of that, it has been an absolute maze to navigate in terms of, okay, I have this information. How do I choose what to dilute and when to present it, and also when to give up and sacrifice? So in that regard, yes. In terms of like following and learning the game, the overall storylines, the meta, I mean, that I wouldn't say is the toughest. I think I've had to make some other sharp adjustments in the past as well. So I wouldn't necessarily say that Valorant's the hardest, but it's definitely not on the easy end, I would say, given how the game changes all the time. But yeah, it's just the delivery portion of it is definitely the hardest I've experienced.
No, for sure. But even so, like, Valorant is a game that I feel is one of its kind in the sense that compared to other FPS titles, it's mostly European, Western dominated. Europe, I mean, of course, Europe is just going to remain on top forever and ever. And they had its moments, still going to be kind of in the bottom. South America, mostly Brazil, and then Asia. I mean, where's Asia? But in Valorant, it's much more different in the sense that it's not just Europe. We got North America on top. We had Brazil on top. We got Laos with 2022. We have Korea on top at times as well. DRX, third place champions 2022, and then also competing for the top spots in VCT Pacific League in 2023, 2024, and then Paper Rex, APAC. Who would have thought that a team from APAC would just be fighting for a world title crown in the FPS genre? And then can't think of any. Latin America, Crew Esports. I mean, come on, like, who's gonna forget about that semifinal run? I've said this many times over and over again, but we've not seen anything like this in Valorant. And that said, I want to now focus on just how the significance of Valorant and the popularity will then play into Pacific, most specifically Korea, as someone that covered the Korean broadcasting scene in esports specifically. Do you feel that Valorant has the potential to reach the same heights as Starcraft, League of Legends, Overwatch, those kinds of games?
So I'm just going to say it pretty confidently. I believe so. I think so. And I've said it actually before for like Korean interviews in the past, that I think Valorant is perfectly poised to become basically the next generation for like Korean esports fans and Korean gamers. We already see it in the player base, right? The entire, in fact, like League of Legends is actually now like an old man's game in Korea, and the reason this works out, I mean, I guess globally as well, but in Korea, because the population is limited compared to other regions, right? Because we're in our own country region, not necessarily the rest of Asia in terms of like server and player base, and then it's a very relatively small country compared to a lot of the other regions we talk about. Therefore, there's really only ever one game that pops off, right? It's just a limitation of how you are able to manage your time as a gamer yourself, right? You're focusing on one game because your friends are playing it, and then everyone's playing that one game. So that's why we always only see like Starcraft being discussed. Then it's League, then it's Overwatch briefly, and then it's League again. But now you start to see Valorant's been just constantly on an upwards trend, granted, because that's the only direction it could go since the beginning of Valorant's release. But the entire player base is very young, and we're starting to, we kept hearing rumblings about, there are these younger players that can't play in VCT yet, but they're coming up, and now we're starting to see a couple of them try to make their breakthrough here in the VCT, whether it's in Challengers or VCT Pacific. So it's perfectly poised for it, and I think already what it's done is it's opened up a much larger audience in Korea to the joys of watching, playing, and cheering for an FPS, right? Like attack FPS. Because while, yes, Overwatch is a first-person shooter, the parts that make Overwatch exciting is very different from, some of these other attack FPSs that we talk about. And so, just the exhilaration of a clutch, right, of an ace, things like that. Like, you don't get to see that in other genres. And now you've already opened up a whole new audience to the fact that, like this game's pretty exciting because those parts I can understand even if I'm not the best at the game. And then you add to that, right, there's characters, etc. So there's always this feeling that there's something for everybody. I think it's very, very well poised. I see the discussion in Korea, like in the Korean communities, grow every time there's a tournament. And then now, obviously, with a bit of the shakeup in the Korean powerhouses, right, with DRX no longer necessarily being on top, Gen G now kind of taking that spot in 24. Now it's getting a lot more heated, but while you don't want to get toxic, it is nice that there's some controversy to be had. It's not just, it's going to be DRX again, and they'll probably get somewhere between 3rd and 6th. That's no longer the discussion in Korea. So it's growing, and I think there's no reason for it to stop within Korea, and I think it's good because now it's not just Valorant, but people have been basically opened up again to new genres that they can enjoy.
No, for real. And you already mentioned a little bit about how Valorant is the hardest game to cover. More so, just focusing on the broadcast side. I mean, looking at your career, it's a career in which, at times, when which I would see a given event, I would accidentally find you on the broadcast. A good example of that is TI8, and I watch the grand finals, sometimes, occasionally, and also True Sight for that event. And I'd see this one person that just kind of speaks so eloquently, so very well, and I was like, man, this guy has the presence of someone that is very experienced, knows what he's talking about, knows how he says it. And when I looked into the names, I was like, Chobra? What? Are you shitting me? It's just wild. Like, quick question before I just go into the main point. Was that the only time you ever covered? Was that the only time that you ever covered Dota?
No, I covered the ESL1 Frankfurt of the year of TI5, and then I covered TI5. So TI8 would have been the third event, but obviously, yes, a much smaller sample size than most of the other games I've worked on.
For sure. Where do you think? Would you rank Valorant broadcast wise for you in terms of like enjoyment and stuff like that? Where would you kind of look at that ranking compared to all the other games that you've covered in your career?
I mean, I think, it's definitely, first of all, it's easily in the top 3. I mean, that's why I'm commentating it regularly. That's why I love doing it. But obviously, especially in terms of the events I've been able to directly be a part of, have I experienced the same highs that I have, for instance, with Starcraft? I would say even the early days of League of Legends, and then some of the other games I've worked on, not yet. But I think that's also because you take a look at the games I've just listed, whether it's StarCraft, League, or even bits of Dota and CS, but I guess more so Dota, since I got to work on the two TIs. There's a lot of history already there, right? So there's already that whole enjoyment of the emotions really coming alive. And something I want to point out, and this goes back to part of the reason I think Valorant's really hard to cast, is it's really hard to identify when is an actual exciting moment in Valorant. And I've heard this analysis and maybe some criticism from other people before as well, where for instance, you take a game of CS or StarCraft or even League. It's pretty obvious when, it's a nice move, or like the scoreline is pretty dominant, but it's not an exciting move, right? Like this happens every other day, or et cetera, or that this one's not as meaningful. Like it's a cool, if it's League of Legends, it's a cool kill, but does it really lead to anything? No, not necessarily. But in Valorant, I think it's still a little hard to identify is this moment really that exciting? Is it really that special? Because the game itself is already so very flashy. Because not only do you have the crazy flicks and the individual mechanics, but then you have the agents that can do some crazy things. And so at what point do you decide, this is pretty common? Let's take, for instance, let's say someone's doing a tiles crunch on Ascent on defense, on the B side. When you make it work, it's always going to look great. But at what point do we say, this is kind of the bread and butter that you have to know now? It's not something to get crazy excited about, unless I guess it leads to like an insane ace in 5 seconds. So those are the things I think everyone's still working to figure out in Valorant. I think obviously everyone's going to have different standards. But I think that's what makes it hard, and perhaps that's why I also personally haven't felt the same high peaks as some of these other games, where those games have had the history, or the game itself lends to very, very clear-cut, like, this has never ever happened before, and then now this is something very special.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to be wrapping this up in a little bit, and just sort of now going back into just the present, and how have you kind of viewed your broadcasting so far in this year in 2024? With us now reaching the halfway point with the ending, nearing the ending as of the time of the recording for Master Shanghai. How do you kind of view yourself in VCT Pacific and just your work in general so far?
I've actually talked about this a little bit on my own stream as well, whenever the question comes up. So first things first, I'm actually pretty happy with where I'm at in terms of like what improvements I'm making and what progress I'm making. I feel like I'm on pace for what I planned for. And the biggest thing is I wanted to make sure that I was like mega confident in terms of actual game knowledge, right? That I was never going into a game thinking like, ooh, like, why is that happening? Like, I don't get it. Like, if it's something I haven't seen before, I didn't consider, I wanted to make sure 10 seconds later, I could tell, oh, this is exactly what this team wanted to do. And I would be confident. I never had to second guess myself. I could still be wrong, right? I don't read everybody's mind, but I wanted to make sure that I had the logic behind it. And I feel that right now I'm at that point. Now, because I've spent so much time there, again, I haven't been able to focus as much on the delivery, which is something I think is very important in commentating and broadcasting. So, if I had to rate myself, quite frankly, I think I'd be pretty strict, and I would say, I give myself like a 6, right? A 6 or 7, somewhere around there, depending on the scale you use. I think I'm fine, but do I think I've really hit it out of the park? Are there matches where I'm thinking like, I've really delivered a great broadcast to the fans? I'll be honest, I don't think so. Maybe 1 or 2 across the several years. So right now I'm actually in the zone of thinking, okay, so what direction do I take that in? How do I make this more fun, right? All this knowledge, all this breakdown, etc., that's all great, but how do I therefore make it more fun while making sure I keep the meaning and not losing out on that, right? So now keeping that scale in balance. And that's, I think, the next steps for me.
No, for sure. Really appreciate you giving me the insight for all of this conversation so far. I'm going to wrap up with one more question to cap it off. Where do you see yourself next year and probably the year after that in terms of just your continued improvement, continued progression, continued preparation, just having to do so in to reach a level that you feel you want to reach. Where you kind of see yourself in a few years from now, and just where you kind of see that gap from where you currently stand to where you want to be at.
So even when I was hosting, or producing, I never do it because I want people to necessarily know that it was like me and my name. Like, right, I don't need my name to always be written next to it. However, my goal in Valorant casting is that I want to know for sure that I left a mark in how Valorant is broadcasted. Right. So, whether it's colleagues giving me the props, whether it's just me realizing that something I've done is now things that people are picking up on, and that's kind of become what people enjoy, what people like about Valorant broadcasting, in terms of commentating and casting. That's my goal. That's always been my goal, no matter which role I did, whether it was hosting, whether it was production. And I feel like, maybe not always perfectly, but I've hit a relative mark on that in the previous positions I've held. So now with Valorant, my goal is, I want to hit that mark of I've helped establish what Valorant casting looks like when it's great. Again, I'm not saying I have to be the only one that's the best. There's going to be several styles always, but I just want to leave that mark, and I want to discover that on my own of, okay, how do I make my strengths come to shine, and therefore kind of help lead and pave the way of other people figuring out how do I also make my broadcast sound good. So that's the goal. How long it's going to take, who knows, but hopefully sooner than later.
Hopefully sooner and later, indeed. And Chobra, really appreciate you taking the time, just talking to me. I understand you're very tired, but really appreciate you just making this happen for me. And yeah, I'm gonna wrap up the interview right now.